My name is Jim Bany. I was in the U.S. Army. My last date of rank was I was a captain.
Okay.
And I was promoted to captain in, it would have been January of 69.
From what years or time frame were you in the Army?
64 through 70.
64 through 70?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And how did you come to serve in the Army, or what led you to join?
Well, my dad was an Army veteran. That early on, that was an influence on me. I kind of toyed with the idea of being a paratrooper, and that was only available in the Army. So that was really my only access to going airborne.
Okay. And where were you stationed at, or where was training for you?
Well, I started out in middle of 64 at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. That's where I took basic training. And then I was sent to Fort Jackson, South Carolina for advanced individual training. From there, I went to jump school at Fort Benning, Georgia. And from there, I went to Special Forces training at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I deployed to Vietnam, came back to Fort Bragg, got sent to Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia. Then I got sent back to Fort Bragg for Officers Special Forces School course. I did Ranger training back at Fort Benning, Dahlonega, and Eglin Air Force Base is where Ranger training finished up. So, and then deployed back to Vietnam, and then went back to Fort Benning in the Ranger Command to end my career, my stint in the Army.
Okay. What were some of the experiences or challenges that you faced when you were first joining up?
When I first joined the Army, oh gosh. Well, I was pretty gung ho because I wanted to be in the airborne, and there was a lot of pushback from that. There was at the time there was a major push toward for draftees for basically, and I noticed a major difference in attitude towards wanting to be in the Army and not wanting to be in the Army. So that was a consideration. I basically joined the Army to I needed a couple of square meals a day and a place to sleep when I got out of high school. So the Army facilitated that. They didn't tell me I was going to sleep on the ground and eat sea rations most of the time, but that was a motivation for sure.
Okay. So can you explain a little bit more about some of that experience with like your training that you had? What were some of the challenges when you were going through that?
Well, I remember being in advanced individual training, and it was basic training, and some pretty strack-looking paratroopers came to do some recruiting who wanted to go to jump school, and there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm for that. And then they said, "Oh, by the way, we pay $55 a month more." And I'm in, you know. Kind of the same thing happened when I was in AIT. They said the SF people, Special Forces people, came along and said, "Look, we're looking for some unique individuals." And by the way, we pay $55 a month more as well. I said, "Hey, this is a good deal." I mean, so it was when you're making $86 a month, $55 a month twice is huge. So,
Oh wow.
yeah.
Well, the pay rates definitely have changed from then.
Yeah. I did it for the money as much as anything probably.
Okay. Do you want to kind of tell us more about some of the deployments you did?
I was really fortunate when I was in Special Forces. I got to go on field training exercises all over the country. That was a lot of fun. It was training, but it was still when you're done training. We were in Biggs Air Force Base, and Juarez was right across the border, and it was a lot of fun at the time. I got some pretty good stories about Juarez. I probably can't repeat them. But yeah, I got to do that. Then I got to go to Vietnam twice. I'm not sure that was a privilege, but I did it. So met my wife when I was in the military. So that was
How old were you at the time?
that I met my wife. I think I was 22.
22. Okay. Was that around the time that you first went to Vietnam?
I met her on my way back to Vietnam on my second tour. She was from Australia, and she was on a trip around the world. And my mother was an Australian war bride, and met my dad during World War II, and they were married in Australia. And then when the war was over, I was born, ironically, 9 months after they were married. So I was a year old when I came over here with my mom. So my wife's parents and my mom were from the same little outback town in Australia. And my wife stopped in to visit my mom, and I happened to come home at the same time. So it took me about 5 minutes, and I figured that this is it. Okay. You're the one.
And what led you up to live in Kansas, or are you originally from here?
No, I'm originally from Minnesota.
Minnesota?
I went to high school in Minnesota, and my wife worked for the Burlington Northern Railroad, and they had a major move. They moved their whole operations department here in 1983, I believe, and so we came with 300 other Minnesota families and overran Overland Park for a while.
Very cool. So back to some of that military experience. So how long was your first tour to Vietnam, or how was that experience like?
I think it was like 10 months because I spent some time in a hospital. I don't remember a whole lot of the details about my first tour. I was in a SOG group. We spent a great deal of time in Laos and Cambodia, what we used to call across the fence, doing recon type of stuff that was highly illegal. We were told that if something happened to you, you basically the procedure was you'd be listed and missing in action for your next of kin type of thing. So it was highly classified. I have never seen the amount of professionalism ever since that I experienced that first tour with those were some hardcore, dedicated SF people that they were pros. I don't think I've ever seen its equal since. I got close when I was in the 101st. Some of those NCOs were the best that the Army had, but those SF people were awesome. My function in that was I carried a radio. I was a commo guy, so there generally was 3 or 4 Americans that would go out on a patrol, and about 6 or 7 mountain yards. We call them yards, and we basically went across the border and reconnoitered the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Basically, that was basically what we did.
And what year was this exactly, or what?
It was 1966.
1966.
Part of 66, yeah.
And then, so then you come back to the States, and what was your experience once you returned to the States?
Well, I got back. I was back about 2 weeks. I was back at Fort Bragg. I was in the 6th Special Forces Group at the time, which now doesn't exist anymore. And I got called up to the group commander's office, and I'm wondering, oh, I'm a E5. What the hell did I do? And had no idea, why they called me up there. And I get into his office and I report to him, and he says, we have an allocation to fill for officer candidate school, and we chose you. And I'm, oh, sorry, sir, I'm not really interested in becoming an officer. So I remember him looking at me, and he says, well, that wasn't a request. He says, you can get your ass to Fort Benning, Georgia, and report in. So I got forced to go to OCS, is my take on it. And OCS is kind of like, a compact version of ROTC. I was one of the few people there that had prior service, and most of them were guys that coming out of college or hadn't finished college, but had the Army had decided that they had some leadership potential. And so what I remember most about OCS probably is the sense of humor. You get a bunch of sex-starved guys that, every female that walks by is beautiful. So the humor that wraps around that it made it bearable.
And how was that different, or to your first basic training to officer? What was the challenges that you faced that were a little different from that experience?
Well, primarily they taught you leadership skills, whereas the rest of the schools were basic training. Is how to march, close order drill, Army procedures, basic things like marksmanship and things like that. And then when you go on to advanced individual training, which mine was infantry, and it's this is the basic the basics about exactly what the infantry does. Officer candidate school included that and the leadership qualities required of being in command.
Was it you mentioned that you were one of the few guys there that had a prior service? Was that a challenge for you, seeing different cadets?
No, it made it easier for me.
Okay.
I got leaned on quite a bit. What's going on? How does the Army really work, and type of things like that from compatriots. But it actually made it easier. They try to put you under, as most Army schools, they try to put you under a lot of stress to figure out a couple of things. They want to know what your ability to make decisions under stress is. That's one of the reasons. They want to know how committed you are to completing that particular course that you were in. Ranger School was a real prime example of that. That it's just it's kind of like high school education, college education, and then an advanced degree education. It's kind of the parallel. They're a little more physical about how they go about that, but yeah.
You mentioned Ranger School too, so how was that experience, and or what were some of those challenges?
Well, I'd already been through Special Forces school, so that it was stressful. I mean, any time that you go without sleep or food for long periods of time, and are wet and uncomfortable, and that's not my idea, the epitome of being fun, but it's something that if you really want to be a professional, that's one of the, I think, schools that is pretty much necessary to. Maybe that's not the right word to put it, way to put it, but it certainly adds to the aura of a professional soldier, for sure. Anytime I see a Ranger tab, I go, oh yeah, me too.
Oh, that's really awesome. So then, what happens after OCS? Where did you go next?
Funny thing. I left B Company of the 6th Special Forces as an E5. I get assigned back to Special Forces as a second lieutenant, and I end up back in B Company of the 6th Group. That was a humiliating experience for the most part. Those NCOs that used to talk to me and on a first name basis as an E5, all of a sudden looked at me like, "Are you crazy? You got to be the dumbest person in the world to be a second lieutenant in a Special Forces company." But I eventually grew out of it. I eventually got promoted to first lieutenant, so it was amazing. It's almost like a paradigm shift. All of a sudden, you're no longer a dumbass, and you've got some intelligence the minute you get promoted. So that's just the way the Army treats second lieutenants. That old adage, two most dangerous things in the Army were trainees with blank ammunition and second lieutenants with maps. Yeah.
Oh man, so how did the guys treat you? Were there any differences?
Oh yeah, yeah. There were. They gave me all kinds. They gave me all kinds of rash. But soon after that, I got enrolled in the Special Forces Officer course, which was I think that was 3 months at the time. And so I was in a school setting again, as opposed to being in a regular training group. So,
what was that training like, or what was different from previous trainings?
when I'd gone through training group, I was a small arms specialist, and when I went through as an officer, it's it leaned heavily on the leadership side, the decision-making process of SF, but it still contained all the oh gosh, there was a an exercise. The name of it was, can't remember the name. Anyway, it puts you in a similar situation that a special forces infiltrating a country and helping out a guerrilla force, training a guerrilla force type of thing, and that exercise lasted like 3 weeks type of thing, and there was always an aggressor force, and it always was held out of Camp McCall or in the Uwharrie National Forest. And I remember that the 82nd Airborne was always the aggressor force that we had to contend with. They didn't play fair, but we didn't either. Gosh, I'm trying to think of the name of that exercise. Anyway, there were numerous other exercises. There was a land navigation course that you had to complete. It was held in the Uwharrie National Forest, and I can't remember if it was 3 or 4 days, and it was like 75 miles that you had to. And they gave you coordinates. You were at a starting point. They gave you coordinates that you had to go to pick up the next coordinates to check in to go to, and there was like 4 different places that you had to check in and get new coordinates and finally get to the end. And you had to do that within that allotted period of time. And I think, if I remember correctly, I think they gave you 3 chances to do that. And I remember years later talking to some of the old guys that had done that course, and every one of them said, "Yeah, we cheated. We cheated like hell. It was the only way we were going to be able to do it." And I did. I fully admit I found a guy that gave me a ride.
Was it this individually, or was it in a group setting, or?
Oh no, this is individual.
Individually?
They put. I think they put 60 pounds on your back, and they gave you 1 day's sea rations, and they gave you a map and a compass, and you had to. The worst part about it was they gave you a mock weapon, and it was like a sandbag, and it weighed 20 pounds, and there was no way that you could put a sling on it or anything else. You had to carry it in one hand while you had your map and compass in the other hand, and it was, anything to make you miserable. They thought of every capability.
Well, that sounds like a really challenging course.
It was. It was one of the hardest things I've ever, including Ranger School. Gosh, I wish I could think of it. Scott, do you remember the name of that?
Robin Sage?
Robin Sage, yes. Yeah.
Robin Sage. That was the name of the
That was
course?
the name of the course, or that 3-week exercise.
Okay. So was the land navigation like a final course that you needed to complete, or was it in the middle of it, or?
It was toward the end.
Towards the end?
Well, it got stretched out because if you didn't complete it the first couple of times, you put it off as long as possible.
Oh wow.
That was one of the toughest things I think I ever did in the military, was that land navigation. Of course, they gave me the worst route and the worst terrain to navigate that they could think of. Uwharrie National Forest it's pretty dense, and there's a lot of hills and rugged country that it's really hard to navigate easily.
Did that experience help out like later on with other trainings, or?
Yeah, when I got to Vietnam the second time, Um, I I became I, I became a platoon leader. That's when the Army in some I'll never understand how the Army came up to make that decision. But I'd been through the enlisted course training group as SF training group. Then I got commissioned, went through SF officers course, and I get back to Vietnam for the second time in the Army. Says, well, we have dire need for platoon leaders up in the 101st Airborne, and that's where we're going to send you. And I said, whoa, I didn't have any recourse. I had to go. So I had no idea how to be a platoon leader at all. But I did know how to read a map. And I was pretty darn good at it.
What were some of the challenges different from that first one to this second tour?
Well, I'm a platoon leader, so I'm in charge of a platoon. I had been affiliated with a small group of no more than maybe 10, maybe a dozen guys on a SOG patrol. I got from 20 to 30 guys in a platoon. It's segmented by responsibilities. You have a platoon sergeant who makes basically all the decisions, in basically the platoon leader or the officer makes the strategic decisions type of thing. So the responsibilities were completely different. The language was different. The SF language, the SF and the rest of the Army they don't even speak the same language. So that was difficult. The SF is real rank heavy. There's lots of E9s and E8s and E7s running around an SF company, and so it's so rank heavy that a lot of those units are on a kind of a first name basis type of thing. Well, you get over in a regular military or a regular Army platoon, and everybody goes by rank, and it's formal. And everybody's responsibility, and you're broke down to who's in charge of. You got a couple of machine gun squads. You got a couple of rifle squads. You have a forward observer generally with you for directing artillery. So it's basically an officer's responsibility is maneuverability and how to deploy, whereas your platoon sergeant takes care of all the personnel and they're really in charge. And I was really fortunate. I got to the 101st, and I got a platoon sergeant. His name is Louis B. Larry. He was probably the greatest soldier I ever encountered, and fortunately for me. And he just took me aside and said, "Hey, okay, Lieutenant, you don't know diddly squat." That's not exactly the way he put it. He said, "You just, I'll teach you everything you need to know," type of thing. And he did. I was smart enough to let him do his thing and just watch for a couple of months until I really got my feet on the ground. So that was a big difference.
Okay. About what size was the platoon?
I'm sorry?
About what size was it? Like how many personnel?
It varied all the way. I remember when we were hard up for people, we had as few as 15 in a platoon, and we'd had as high, on the high side, maybe 30. And it varied. from, how much contact you were in. Guys get wounded. A few of them got killed. It just varied. There's a lot of malaria was a big detriment. There was a couple other diseases that really affected. Dysentery was when you're out in the field. It always amazed me the amount of disease that guys got. That jungle rot was one of them that made life miserable for everybody. Basically, sores or lesions that won't heal. When it rains every day, trying to stay dry was a major effort, and mold and all the insect bites were real rampant. I remember red ants. You'd be walking through the jungle, and the red ants would be on the leaves, and you'd brush them on, and they'd get on your skin. And they were really bad. If they got between your rucksack and your back, they'd take a hunk out of you. Scorpions were another. If you were in a foxhole, scorpions would come right through the wall of a foxhole and nail you. And you're trying to maintain silence at night, and you hear somebody scream in agony because they got nailed with a scorpion. It had its challenges, for sure. I've actually seen red ants take a hunk out of guys. We were in a firefight a couple of times, and guys would stand up in the middle of a firefight to try to get the red ants off from them. Leeches were another really. Leeches and ticks. They were real prolific. I got tick bites in places that I didn't know you could get tick bites. We always used to tease each other about if you got enough tick bites, they'd send you into the hospital and have some good-looking nurse have to pull the ticks off of you. Is what the goal was.
About how long were your patrols, or how long were you out there at a time?
First tour, we'd be out from 3 to 10 days, type of thing, and hoping that you didn't make contact with the North Vietnamese. And if you did, that you tried to get pulled out right away. The second tour, we had a situation where we'd be out in the field for a couple months, and what they would do is they would resupply you every fourth day. They would resupply you with food and ammo, and any medical attention that you need. And on the eighth day, they would you'd set up where they would bring out a meal, new clothes. It was a major resupply day. Where that fourth day was all they'd do is shove it out of a passing helicopter type of thing and hope it didn't land on top of you. But yeah, so it was every 8 days for the major resupply, and the battalion surgeon would come in and look at guys and things like that. Once every 2 months, they would pull you back to the rear area and what we used to call a stand down, and just give you a rest type of thing. When I was first over there, we were headquartered. I was just the first brigade of the 101st was the only one that was there at the time. It was before the whole division got there, and our base camp was at Phan Rang, which was about 50 clicks south of Cam Ranh Bay. and it was right on the ocean. And they'd pull us back, and we'd go swimming in the ocean and things like that to get rid of the salt water. Would get rid of the jungle rot and cuts and bruises and things like that. So, and then later on, we didn't have access to Fan Rang anymore. So what they would do is they would pull a platoon out of the field to pull security for the Battalion Tactical Operations Center, and that was the only time I let my guys use air mattresses. Otherwise, we always slept on the ground. Air mattresses made a noise. There were the tubes, and you'd blow them up at night, and there were the tube type things. And if somebody ran their feet across an air mattress, that made a distinct sound, and that was a no-no if you were trying to maintain sound discipline. So I never let my guys in the field use them until we got back in the rear area.
You mentioned a lot about keeping silence. Can you explain about why that was a thing that you had to do or maintain?
Well, you relied on your senses in the jungle. You rely on your senses for everything, and the two things that really the sensories that you really depend on: your smell and your hearing. So you want those as sharp as possible. Night vision is another critical one. But when you're in the jungle at night and you're in triple canopy, there's no light penetration from anything. And you cannot see this far in front of your face. And so night vision was that didn't last very long. It just didn't work.
Well, that sounds like a really tough challenge.
It was, yeah. Every once in a while, we needed to make night maneuvers, and they were always chaos. They were just chaos because you couldn't see 3 feet in front of you, type of thing. So,
what were some of the tactics or training that you did or that your guys did in order to overcome some of those obstacles?
A lot of them you couldn't overcome. You just had to barrel through. If you were in triple canopy jungle or thick vegetation, moving through bamboo was real difficult. If the only way you could do it was single file. The point man had to use a machete to cut his way through the jungle, basically, and that made noise. So you couldn't always overcome that. Where the vegetation wasn't that thick, you could maneuver a lot better than some of the. If you had to move a couple of kilometers in any direction, in thick vegetation, that might take you all day, type of thing. And whereas it wasn't so thick, you could probably make a couple of kilometers in an hour, type of thing. So it really varied.
What were some of the objectives that you were trying to accomplish, or some of the missions?
Well, first tour, it was we were trying to determine how much traffic was on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and where it was going and what they were taking, what they were moving. The second tour, after the Tet Offensive, the 101st was relegated to the Ashaw Valley, which was a major distribution point for the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and it was up close to the or the Laotian and North Vietnamese border. So there was a heavy amount of traffic going through that, and our mission was just to impede as much of that traffic as we could and engage whatever we could find. We didn't have any problem finding it. They found us.
Oh,
Yeah.
you mentioned the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Can you explain a little bit more about what that was and what was going on with other?
Well, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a jungle causeway from North Vietnam down all the way down to the Delta in various parts, and it's how the North Vietnamese supplied their endeavors into the South, basically, and there was all kinds of offshoots from it. There were even roads where they were driving trucks down it. We ran across a 6-inch gas pipeline one time. All kinds of telecommunication, telephone wire, strung out type of thing. And it wasn't legal for the U.S. to be in Laos or Cambodia type of thing. It was which was a political decision. And so basically when I was there, what we were doing was trying to reconnoiter that as much as possible. That changed later on after about the midpoint of '68. It became obvious that what we were doing in Laos and Cambodia was exactly that, trying to reconnoiter what was going on there. And so the North Vietnamese made an effort to try and stop that as much as possible, which I wasn't a part of that. It wasn't. That was a ploy on our part to have them deploy as many troops as possible to try and stop us from basically seeing what was going on in there. Usually, if we found a major arms depot or a shipment depot or something like that, the only ploy that we had on our part was basically B-52 strikes, and that's what they'd call in. And then they'd say, okay, we used to have bomb damage assessments. We have to go in after a B-52 strike and check it out and see what was going on. That wasn't fun. I could still, every time, even 4th of July, I smell the cordite out of fireworks. That brings back some bad memories.
Oh man. Did you make contact with any of the civilians there or anything like that?
There weren't any civilians.
No?
There were some very primitive mountain yards. Occasionally you would run into some of them, but for the most part it was completely uninhabited. And if there were any, the North Vietnamese would have demolished them anyway.
So then after that, you returned back to the States. How was it different from that then? From your first experience to your second deployment, coming back to the States? Were you married at that time by then?
I didn't get married until after my second deployment.
Okay.
So you're asking what was it like coming back after my second deployment? Well, I was newly married, so that was a new experience, and I was stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia, and I would run across. I'd meet up with guys all the time that I had been with, particularly during my second tour. The Army ran a school for senior captains and majors. And Scott, what's the name of the course at Benning for?
The advanced course?
The advanced course, yeah. So I'd run into guys I knew from those there all the time at Fort Benning, and we always used to have get-togethers, and it became real apparent to me that I didn't have a college education, and if the Army made it real clear that I wasn't going to be able to stay in the Army without a college education. I could stay in the Army, but there's two types of commissions in the Army. There's regular Army commission, reserve commission, and there are some guarantees with a regular Army commission, whereas with a reserve commission, you're at the mercy of the Army as to what they want to do with you in terms of manpower. And so it became real obvious that I didn't have a college education, which was a requirement for a regular Army commission, and that I was either going to have to get out and go to college, or the Army at the time was seriously considering sending me back to Vietnam for the third time. And by this time I'm married, and I had a wife to think about, and I also had to. My parents didn't know that I'd gone to Vietnam the first time. I kind of hid that really well, but they knew the second time that I went, and it was really, really difficult on my dad. He would not come home at night for fear there was going to be a Army vehicle parked out front with bad news. So I had that to think about, and my wife kind of subtly pointed out that I really needed to get a formal education, and so I made the decision to get out of the Army, as much as I didn't want to. That was a real tough decision for me to make.
And did you end up going to college anywhere then?
Yeah, I went. I got out in the summer of 1970, and I enrolled at the University of Minnesota. 1970 was a bad time to get out of the Army. It was. There was a lot of anti-war sentiment out at the time. Minnesota was a particularly bad place for that at the time, and so getting out of the Army was pretty traumatic for me.
Do you still keep in contact with some of the soldiers that you served in with?
Yeah,
like, were they...
I do. Took a while. My former company commander, the first company commander I had on my second tour, is just an incredible soldier. He pleaded and kind of convinced me that I needed to make contact with a few of the guys that were left, and I've done, and it's been a pretty cathartic experience to meet up with those guys. I go to a yearly reunion down in Tampa, Florida, with the 101st, and that's always fun to rub elbows with old soldiers that particularly ones that you've been in combat with. You've got a bond that it's hard to explain, but you just got to look somebody in the eye and you know that. And so we get together and there's two ways to start a war story. There's um, the first one is no shit, this really happened, and the other one is no shit, there I was. So we get a lot of that going on.
That's awesome. Can you tell us a little bit more about your transitioning? You mentioned that it was really difficult for you to leave the Army. How was it like moving from that to the next stage in your life?
Really, really difficult. I was 24 years old. I was a captain. I was somebody. I was a master parachutist. I wore a Ranger tab. It was CIB. I was somebody in the Army. I got out in the civilian life, and I was just another Joe. So I lost my identity, and I spent a long time searching for that again. It took me a long time to regain that purpose in life.
What was some of the things that kind of helped?
Things that helped. Probably the first thing that positive in that regard. I knew the Vietnam Veterans Memorial had been dedicated in 1982, and it's still pretty emotional for me. I knew 44 names on that wall, and I knew that someday I was going to have to make that pilgrimage to the wall to physically see those names. I waited a long time. I waited till 1994 before I finally stirred up the courage to make that trip to the wall. And it was probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, that first trip to the wall. I've been there a couple of times, half a dozen times at least since then. It's gotten easier, but it's still pretty emotional for me. I've been the Vietnam Veterans Foundation has a moving wall that goes around the country, and I've been last year at this time. They had a 3/4 scale wall at the World War I memorial, and even that, I took my grandkids to that, and that was even difficult. Pop, how do you know this guy? Type of thing. That doesn't get any easier.
That kind of goes into the next question I was going to ask, but I was going to say, how do you feel or reflect upon your service today? Like, would you do it again if you had the option to, or?
Would I do it again? You know what? It was the best of times, and it was absolutely the worst of times. That's the only way I can explain it. Every once in a while I get caught in that conundrum of, was I doing my patriotic duty, or was I just cannon fodder for a bad cause. I can look back on it now, particularly with some of the guys I served with, and see what they've accomplished in their lives, and I I I I was able to, when I went to college, I eventually got a degree in architecture, and couldn't stand standing at a drawing board. That was my whole world, and I've always been an active person. I love to work with my hands, and I became a carpenter. And I stayed with it. I became a union carpenter. Eventually, I I became what's called a construction superintendent, and that's I physically run a construction site, and that's where I've had to. I was able to use all the leadership skills that I learned in the military and apply them to the construction trades, and that was a huge contribution to my own well-being. And I eventually got to the point where, the good Lord put me on this earth. I thought at first was to be a warrior. And I eventually learned that he put me on this earth to be a builder. And once I embraced that, I got to the meaning. I got to a point where this is why I'm here, and this is what makes me happy, and I can accomplish some. I can make this world a better place.
Do you have anything else that you would like to add?
I was digging around in my old duffel bag, which I hadn't done in just years and years and years, and I came across with my first Green Beret. This thing is over 60 years old. It's got a lot of lint on it, but there are some good times, and I can, gosh, walking in a bar wearing a Green Beret, didn't have to buy a drink. Kill a lot of brain cells for nothing. Yeah. And you look back at the good things that happened in the military, and you kind of put those things that weren't so good at the back of your mind and not think about them. And every once in a while they come up, but you deal with it.
Do you want to tell us a little bit more about how you got that, or?
Yeah, well, when you're issued one when you get assigned to a special forces unit, and before you're qualified, it's just a small strip, and then once you're qualified in whatever endeavor you're doing, they give you the full patch. This happens to be the patch for the 6th Special Forces Group, which no longer is in existence, but I guess it's an antique now.
That's very cool. Like that.
I wanted to ask, you mentioned the first two where you were spending some time in the hospital. Were you wounded, or how did you get in the hospital?
Gosh, I had a explosion happened over top of me, and I got a plastic cap in the back of my head that time. I got a bunch of shrapnel in my butt and my back another time. I lost these 3 fingers another time, and they put them back for me. They sent me to Japan for that. And pretty much got full function of my fingers. I had another explosion, a grenade explosion. I blew out both of my eardrums. I didn't go to the hospital at that time, and I kicked myself for that because I should have. And then a couple of months later, I was cross trained when I was in SF as an engineer, and demolitions was a part of that. So I remember trying to blow out an LZ, a landing zone to take a resupply, and I was wrapping this tree stump with, it was a full tree. I wanted to blow it over, and I remember wrapping it with det cord, and an incoming round came off and set the det cord off, and I blew out my eardrum and got all kinds of wood chips that they had to pick out of me that time. What other? I've got more than one Purple Heart, and I've always kind of considered it as the ultimate of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So I wasn't exactly. My battalion commander used to say, he says, "You be careful when you walk in the rain. You're going to rust. You got so much metal in you." So, yeah, I spent quite a bit of time in a hospital. Good-looking nurses.
Was that mostly from your first tour or your second tour?
I kind of divided it up between the two of them. Yeah. Okay. And then they came out with a rule later that if you had 2 Purple Hearts, that they wouldn't let you back in the field, that you had to stay in the rear area. Found a job for you in the rear area, but that didn't. That was too late for me.
You said you were there during the Tet Offensive, is that right?
I was, yeah.
And you were how close to or were you? It was kind of all over the place, I guess. Were you in the middle of it, or?
I was in the 9030 VAC hospital in Long Bend. I got a piece of shrapnel in my back of my leg and my butt, and so when Tet broke out, and so. I went AWOL from the hospital, and my unit was at Tonsonute. They'd gotten called into Tonsonute, and it was a couple of days of Tet of that, and then they sent us up to Hue, and so that I spent the rest of that Tet offensive. Basically, the Battle of Hue. We were on the south side of Hue. There was a monastery that the NVA had taken over, and it was determined. We had the intel that there wasn't anybody but NVA, and it got determined that. That the only way we're going to get them out of there is destroy this, centuries-old building, which was a real sad thing to do. But they pretty much decimated it, and we went in after that. I remember, and we found the wine cellar. I remember that. There was we had to actually stop for a day or so to get sobered up. And then there was hell to pay for that after it, but I remember my platoon sergeant came up to me with this bottle of wine, and it said vintaged in 1923. And he said, "You think this would be any good?" And I said, "You'll probably never get anything better in your life again," type of thing. Yeah, those are the good times.
So did you see Full Metal Jacket?
I'm sorry?
Did you see Full Metal Jacket?
No, I don't delve into to anything. I watched um, what was it? Tom Hanks movie,
Forrest Gump.
Forrest Gump. That's about as involved with any combat films that I care to see.
You seen the real thing? Don't care to see a recreation? Pretty much.
Yeah, it doesn't interest me at all. The other people ask me that now that that Vietnam is open to tours and things, that if I ever had the inclination to want to go back, and the time I spent in Vietnam was basically in the jungle. I can remember maybe a half a dozen times, and both times that I was out of the jungle type of thing. So, Vietnam to me is bomb craters and artillery craters that I really don't have any desire to see any more of that.
So, Jim, I've got a question for you. So you were in the 1st Brigade, or
Yeah.
101st,
Uh-huh.
and you told me before about who your commander was.
Ah. Yeah, thought a lot about that. We had, when I first got there, I was there about 3 months, I guess, and they made a change of command in our battalion, and the guy who took over, I don't know if I really don't know if being that this is broadcast, if I should really even say his name, but he was pretty notorious. To say that I highly disliked him would be an understatement. Anyway, he became real famous in the military for starting a Delta Force. That basically is all you can probably tell who it is from that. This about basically all I'll say about it. I highly disliked him. I thought he ruined a lot of very, very fine officers' careers by either he was one of these individuals who either he really liked you or he hated you, and if he didn't like you, you're basically your career was over type of thing. And I had numerous run-ins with him as a lieutenant, and it always didn't turn out so good on my part. But that's kind of my claim to fame is I served under this particular battalion commander, and I lived through it. So that's all I'll say about that. I can converse with Scott, because we know the names and things like that, and it's intermilitary. But I'll leave it at that.
Could you contrast maybe that particular commander's style and the way that he led with another commander who, said, "This is what this is the way I'd want to be instead."
He would put limitations on he was a micromanager, and he would put limitations on what you could do and what he considered you didn't want to do, type of thing. And one particular time I remember, we were in the Ashaw, and the particular company that I was in, we ran into some concrete reinforced bunkers that the NVA had built up, and there was just there's just no way we were going to be able to overtake them by just overrunning them, type of thing. We could not. We didn't have the firepower to do that, and he couldn't understand that. He couldn't understand why we just didn't en masse, sheer determination, do that, overtake that. And the assistant division commander happened to be in the area and was on our commo net, and he landed back in the area, and he asked me he asked everybody's opinion what we could do about it. And I said, well, the one thing that I know that probably would work is if we could get a hold of 106 recoilless rifles, which we had in the battalion. And he said, I'll have them right out. And the battalion commander found out about it, and there was, I mean, it was just retribution type of thing, It was just a bad deal. So he just, like I say, I thought he was an alcoholic, and a couple of people have agreed with me at that who knew him. Another particular incident where I came back from the hospital, and myself and two other enlisted guys, we walked into the battalion area, and he drove by in his Jeep, and the first thing he said was, you guys get a haircut, type of thing. It wasn't, oh man, I'm glad to see you back, or anything like that. I'm just impressed with your dedication to it. You'd think enough to come back, type of thing. And that was what we had an expression in the Army called chicken shit. That's, pardon my French, but that's he just epitomized that kind of stuff.
You want to tell us?
Did that answer your question, Scott?
It did, yeah. But the other part of it was there a battalion commander whose style was the opposite?
He stayed the whole time I was there. In fact, we deroached the same time.
All right.
The previous one, it was a little different situation. The previous one, he'd been commandant of cadets at West Point, his previous duty assignment, so he's punching a ticket for at least 3 stars with the battalion, and he was much more of a West Point era type of. He cultivated the guys from West Point.
Okay.
When I was in the battalion, there were 3 ROTC officers, and there were 2 OCS, two as their OCS, and so, it was that was ring knockers. We called the West Point graduates always had big rings, and they let you know by doing this, especially on a bar. Yeah. Good times.
I never heard that term before. That's really funny, though.
Ring knockers?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us, maybe share a little bit more about your experience, about going through Green Beret training or anything like that?
No, I was. There wasn't a lot of difference between going through there was difference in the standpoint. It was much more technical when I went through a training group, enlisted, and then when I went through as an officer, it was much more scoped toward leadership and leadership solutions and things of that nature. Which was I was basically able to, even though I was still a second lieutenant at the time I went through as an officer, it was just kind of built on the same principles, leadership principles that I learned in OCS. So, yeah.
Did you ever have any challenges when it came to leading your platoon or a group of guys?
Did I have any challenges? Oh, sure, lots of them. You're dealing with it, with individuals. I was adamant with the first thing. My first platoon Sergeant Larry taught me. He says, what you're not used to dealing with in SF that is adamant here is chain of command. You got to use a chain of command. And he drummed that into my head, type of thing. And so if I had a problem with one of the private E3s or whatever, I had to go through the platoon sergeant, the squad leader, and the section leader to be able to handle that. And a lot of that was, okay, what do you think? Give me your feedback, type of thing. So where SF that is such a cohesive team that you almost knew what everybody else was thinking, type of thing. For sure.
Seems like you guys were really close.
So you're on first name basis with just about everybody in an SF unit. And one of my favorite stories is there are 5 sergeant majors running around one SF company. And everybody's on a first name basis, like I said, because it's so rank heavy. Well, I get to the 101st, and there's one sergeant major in the whole battalion, and he's God. And the first time I ran into this sergeant major, said, "Hi, Top, how you doing? I'm first lieutenant by this time." And he comes up to me and he gets this far in front of my nose and he says, "That's sergeant major to you, shitbird." Yeah. One of my favorite stories. We never did get along real well after that. I meet with a bunch of guys on a weekly basis. We meet every Friday morning at the Village Inn in Merriam. They're all Vietnam vets, and for the most part, and it's we don't talk about Vietnam a whole lot, maybe just a little bit, but it's really easy to see how that part of their lives has influenced the rest of their lives. It's really evident to me, and that's become a real interesting phenomenon to me. That there's brothers in arms out there that went through the same shit I did, so, and had good times as well,
Oh yeah.
and they're very proud of their military service. They wear it on their hat. And I'm a Vietnam veteran type of thing. I'm not that blatant about it, but and every time I see a guy wearing a military hat, I go up to him and greet him. That I'm part of that fraternity, which is proud to say I am.
Well, thank you.
Can I get one thing done? I'd like to get a close-up of your shirt there and also have you hold the beret again.
I'll do better than that. I haven't done this in a while.
that feel?
It's a little strange. It's been a long time.
Still fits?
Yeah, barely.
Very good.
You had shorter hair.
Yeah, bigger head.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for your service, and thank you for participating in our oral history project here.